Meanwhile, on Nagara's bridge, Kusaka was hunting around for a flag for Kid Butai's commander. Nagara wasn't accustomed to hosting such visitors, and Kimura's flag locker was devoid of the proper pennant for a Vice Admiral a rising sun flag with a broad red stripe bordering the top edge. Kusaka resorted to the expedient of taking Kimura's rear admiral pennant, which had red stripes on both top and bottom, and simply tearing the bottom stripe off. In the words of one historian, the effect was tattered but certainly no worse than the fleet. Nagumo probably could not have cared less, as his mind was already on bigger game. In the midst of receiving Kimura's deferential disinclination to tow Akagi clear, Nagumo had been handed a message that caused him to focus on other matters. It was Chikuma No. 5's 11:10 sighting report. Whereas a 90-mile separation from the enemy might have given Yamaguchi pause, it was the best news Nagumo had received in hours. It apparently meant that the enemy had continued to close with his position, and along the same bearing. If this was true, with a bit of luck it might be possible to engage the Americans in a daylight surface action. To a man like Nagumo, this was an enticing prospect. A former torpedo officer, he knew what his surface forces could do to the enemy given the chance. Thus, far from moping about on Nagara, Nagumo shortly thereafter decisively reassumed command of the battle and tried to take the fight to the enemy. For his part, since assuming a brevet command at 10:50, Admiral Abe had been casting about for the best response to the situation. He had already notified Yamamoto and Kondo of the tragedy that had befallen Kid Butai. But what best to do with the forces remaining? He had heard nothing from Nagumo and was probably beginning to fear the worst. At 11:27, Abe tried to raise Nagumo directly, asking Akagi, "Is your radio working?" The lack of reply was its own answer. Abe, with Chikuma No. 5's recent sighting report in his hands, as well decided, there was only one thing he could do, and that was attack the approaching enemy. At 11:30, his flagship blinkered Chikuma. "Prepare for torpedo action." However, scarcely had he signalled Chikuma than the radio crackled with a hail from Admiral Kimura on Nagara, informing him that Nagumo had transferred his flag. To Abe's unspoken question of whether Nagumo was injured or capable of command came an immediate answer, as Nagumo shortly fired off a full update to Yamamoto, Kondo, and all commands. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu sustained considerable damage as a result of enemy bombing attack at about 10:30. Fires have broken out aboard them, and they are unable to participate in any operations. I, Sin C 1st Air Fleet, have transferred to the Nagara. After attacking the enemy, I plan to lead my forces to the north. Grid position. I, A000. Thereafter, the mobile fleet's new flagship began drawing away from the blazing Akagi. It was a poignant and symbolic moment. Proud Akagi had been Nagumo's home for 14 months since the formation of 1st Air Fleet. Those months had been heady ones for Kid Butai. Now Nagumo would have to win or lose without her, with just a single carrier, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 5 destroyers. Despite this daunting prospect, Nagumo's reaction was aggressive. He was clearly focused on returning at least some of the punishment he had just taken. Hiryu's counterattack should soon reach the enemy, with a second to follow. All that remained was for the surface ships to find an opening to contribute as well. Nagara continued accelerating, her bow cutting the water purposefully as Nagumo closed to rejoin the remainder of his fleet. Within 10 minutes of leaving Akagi behind, he was back in blinker range of Abe on tone. Having heard Nagumo's report to combined fleet at 11:30, Abe anticipated matters and blinkered Nagumo at 11:43. I have a part of Crew Div 8, Bat Div 3, and Desron 10 prepared to go to the attack of the enemy. Nagumo shortly blinkered back to Abe. Hold up. Eager as he was to close the enemy, he didn't want Nagara bringing up the rear. He would lead this counter-attack in person. First, though, he needed to reform his scattered ships into some sort of battle formation. As Nagara closed with the main gaggle of the mobile fleet, Yamaguchi also became involved. Hearing the radioed plans for attack, at 11:47 Cardiff II's commander countermanded his previous instruction regarding the screen for the damaged carriers. He radioed Tone, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, instructing them to leave one destroyer with the damaged carriers and have the others proceed on the course of attack. If there was to be a surface battle, Yamaguchi wanted all the offensive power that could be mustered. In the event, though, it appears that this message may have been garbled or simply ignored, as 2 destroyers were with each burning carrier from this time forward. Isokaze and Hamakaze stood by Soryu, Nowaki and Arashi stuck close to Akagi, and Hagekaze and Maikaze sadly circled Kaga. If he had any objections to Yamaguchi's interjection, Nagumo gave no sign. Over the following minutes, he sent out orders informing his units that they should assemble, as he planned to take to the attack now. Just before noon, he amplified his instructions, ordering his formation to form in order of Desron 10, Crew Div 8, and Bat Div 3. Course 170 degrees, speed 12 knots. Shortly thereafter, Nagara came bounding up from the south as the 2 battle wagons and Abe's sleek cruisers turned to meet her. The sense of excitement within the mobile fleet was palpable. Nagumo's strategy was a simple one. He would head nearly straight for the enemy on a reciprocal bearing. Under the cover of Hiryu's strike waves, he would close to within gun and torpedo range. As if to further spur such hopes, word from Vice Admiral Kondo's Second Fleet arrived at noon. "We are in position Wayu Miku 00 at 1200. Course 50 degrees, speed 28 knots. We are heading for the mobile force." With reinforcements on the way, Nagumo set off on his quest. Thus, the common interpretation that Yamaguchi was essentially running the battle from Hiryu with Nagumo in Nagara tagging along behind his subordinate is not true. In fact, Yamaguchi and Hiryu trailed in Nagumo's wake, while his superior led his remaining heavy forces east, seeking battle. And while Yamaguchi essentially operated independently as far as air operations were concerned, his general course took its lead from Nagumo's own movements and were no more aggressive than those of his commander. Knowing what we know today, the very notion of Nagumo's charging an enemy who had just devastated the mightiest carrier force in the world seems laughable. For his part, Nagumo certainly knew that he was engaged in a long shot, but his actions show that at midday on 4th of June, making some kind of retaliation that would allow Kondo and Yamamoto time to enter the battle was absolutely foremost in his mind. Nagumo was acting promptly to seize what he felt was his only remaining chance in the battle. Escape was not part of his agenda, at least not yet. It cannot be ruled out, of course, that he was subconsciously seeking death in battle to atone for the debacle. But whatever the motivation, the picture that emerges is not one of a broken admiral, but rather a man desperately striving to make good on a decidedly grim situation. His decision to attack in this manner was also supported by the facts that he had at hand, which suggested that the enemy lay only 90 miles distant. He first had to assemble his dispersed vessels, but as soon as he had done so, he shaped a course designed to bring him straight at the Americans' supposed position. If they could bridge the gap, an hour's gunnery from the battle wagons would be all it took to settle accounts. Not only that, but nightfall was coming, and with it the promise of reinforcement by Kondo's forces. Even if Kid Butai could just locate the enemy in the coming darkness, Kondo might be able to finish the job. It was true that Nagumo was down to just one carrier, but Hiryu's own planes were even then counter-attacking, which might even the odds a bit. And what is also often overlooked is that the Japanese were well aware of the brutal losses they had inflicted on the Americans' torpedo squadrons. Without torpedo planes, the enemy would have a much harder time sinking Nagumo's battleships, which could more easily shrug off hits from the Dauntlesses. Given that, it was not unreasonable to suppose that Haruna and Kirishima, as well as Crew Div 8, with their high speed and deadly torpedoes, might survive air attack long enough to close the range. This was especially true if Hiryu's aircraft managed to cripple one of the enemy carriers. Nagumo's naval culture surely exerted an influence on his behavior in this regard. Nagumo was conscious of the fact that Admiral Inoue had suffered considerable censure in the aftermath of the Battle of Coral Sea in the eyes of Combined Fleet's staff for allowing the loss of carrier Shoho and the crippling of Shokaku to lead him to prematurely abandon his enterprise. Nagumo's eagerness to launch a surface attack perhaps derived from a desire to not repeat such a hasty cessation of maximum effort. It must be recalled, too, that at this time only Soryu had been definitively written off. It was not yet clear that Kaga and Akagi would not be saved and brought back into the battle. Finally, it must be admitted that in behaving as he did, Nagumo was conforming to Japanese societal norms as well, which value the integrity of an act more than its likely results. In Japanese culture, there is a readier acceptance of the nobility of failure, while giving it one's best effort. One of the most popular Japanese exhortations is ganbatte, which translates roughly to, "Please continue trying to do your best." This principle applies equally when the task in question is difficult, odious, or even doomed. Winning is optional. Trying your best is not. Likewise, performing in an honourable fashion today is more important than the long-term implications for tomorrow. This attitude is part of the enduring fascination of Japan's navy, because it is so alien to Western modes of thinking. Taken together, it's somewhat easier to see why Nagumo believed at midday that while the battle was desperate, it was not yet hopeless. However, despite his understandable desire to take the battle to the enemy, both Nagumo and Yamaguchi would have done well to ponder the dangers Hiryu found herself in, especially given that the American carrier force was as yet undamaged. While the apparent proximity of the Americans was good news for Nagumo, it was quite the opposite for Yamaguchi's lone remaining carrier. Both Nagumo and Yamaguchi should have been concerned with keeping some distance between her and the more powerful American carriers. Instead, Hiryu, almost by default, continued closing with the enemy. There was no need to do this. Even had Hiryu moved northwest, her aircraft had all the range they needed to strike back, and then some. Hitting back at the enemy made good sense. Needlessly exposing Hiryu to long odds did not. At this juncture in the battle, the principle of calculated risk that informed Chester Nimitz's strategy of strong attritional tactics was eminently suited to the Japanese position as well. Indeed, a careful assessment of the odds against Hiryu would have revealed two things. First, immediately before Kobayashi's launching, Yamaguchi had exactly 37 aircraft of all types left on board her, 10 Zeros, 18 dive bombers, and 9 carrier attack planes. Another 27 cap fighters were still aloft, most of them refugees from the other 3 carriers, for a total of 64 Japanese carrier aircraft of all types left in operation. In other words, Kid Butai's air power was down to about a quarter of what it had been at 0430. In terms of strike aircraft, the tally was even worse. Hiryu's torpedo squadron had, for all intents and purposes, been wrecked already. This notched down the number of strike planes available to Kid Butai to under a fifth of the morning's total. Second, the nature of the morning's battle should have given Yamaguchi and Nagumo fair warning that they were most likely now badly outnumbered. The incessant American attacks had involved large numbers of aircraft, many of which were carrier types. It should have been apparent that the dive bomber attack at 10:20–10:25 could not have been launched by a single American flight deck. Japanese aerial attack doctrine was the same as that of the Americans on this point, committing a full attack squadron per enemy carrier in order to assure its destruction. The mere fact that 3 Japanese flat tops had been attacked simultaneously argued strongly that the Americans had at least 2 carriers in the fight. Attacking such a powerful force was dangerous in the extreme, especially given the state of Japanese reconnaissance and their generally depleted air power. Notwithstanding the advisability of attempting a surface attack against the Americans, there was no reason to drag Hiryu into such a brawl if it could be helped. Both Nagumo and Yamaguchi knew that Kondo's invasion support force was the nearest substantial Japanese formation to them. But they also knew that Kondo offered little in the way of immediate succor to the 1st Carrier Strike Force, having no air power of its own. The other major force in the neighbourhood, of course, was the main body. Bringing up the rear some 300 miles behind Nagumo, Yamamoto and his big guns could not hope to be in the battle for another day at least. Plus, there was little in the way of organic air power in Yamamoto's force either. Light carrier Hosho provided a bare minimum of air cover over the main body, but was in no way a power projection asset. Without aircraft to defend the battleship force, even the mighty Yamato would find herself in peril. The truth was that while the main body could potentially destroy an enemy surface force already brought to bay, it had neither the speed to overhaul the swift American carriers should they wish to avoid battle, nor the means to defend itself against the Americans if they retained air superiority. The same was true of Kondo's force as well. If new air power was to be scraped together, it would have to come from the 2nd Carrier Striking Force, centred on Junyo and Ryujo. While neither of these carriers was the cream of the fleet, between them they could at least field about 60 aircraft, which was a credible number at this point in the battle. Yet, while the 1st Carrier Strike Force was burning off of Midway, Dai ni Kido Butai was more than 1,600 miles to the north, involved in reducing Dutch Harbour's defences. They wouldn't be able to rendezvous with Nagumo for several days at least. Even if they could do so, it would still be vital to preserve Hiryu and her polyglot air group. If nothing else, having the ability to put her 37 Zeros over the main body would increase the odds of Yamamoto being able to bring the fleet's big guns to bear. Given all this, Yamaguchi, and Nagumo in particular, needed to judge the situation very carefully. Since Hiryu was almost certainly outnumbered by her opponents, it was unlikely that she would be able to alter the tide of battle by herself. There would come a time, probably not far in the future, when Cardiff II's flagship would no longer be capable of projecting a meaningful amount of firepower against the enemy. When that time came, the logical course of action would be to preserve her for future operations. As a result, the Japanese needed to fight smart. If they were to extricate Hiryu from this mess, she needed to be positioned at the limits of the enemy's range, so she could withdraw promptly when the time came. This course of action, if it even occurred to Nagumo or Yamaguchi, apparently did not recommend itself. Their natural inclination was to fight, and fighting meant attacking. However, their manner of assault meant that they were essentially driving a wasting asset right into the enemy's maw. In truth, both admirals were somewhat to blame in this matter. Nagumo certainly seems to have neglected issuing any direct orders regarding Hiryu's disposition, letting Yamaguchi handle her affairs directly. It's easy to believe that during this time of supreme crisis, Nagumo had largely reverted to his torpedo commander ways. He was focusing almost solely on the surface battle he was trying to create, rather on overseeing the fate of what was arguably still the single most important vessel in the Japanese force. There is no indication that Yamaguchi gave any heed to this matter either. Granted, in the absence of direct orders to the contrary, Yamaguchi was essentially constrained to follow Nagumo's general lead. But there is no evidence to suggest that he went down this path unwillingly. We know enough about Yamaguchi's character to believe that if the commander of Cardiff II had had reservations, he would have voiced them. We know, too, that Yamaguchi had been encouraged by Ugaki in times past to take such license if he felt he needed to. Ugaki had worried before the battle that First Air Fleet, under Nagumo's tepid leadership, might not be able to accomplish its mission in future sea operations, in which every kind of change must be expected to happen. And yet here, at a point in time in which Ugaki's favourite commander might have improvised a little, Yamaguchi stuck rigidly to a heroic script. In so doing, he would lead his remaining carrier to ruin precisely because of his unwillingness to adapt to changing circumstances, a failing that Ugaki had ironically pinned on Nagumo. Much as with Nagumo's decision to close the enemy and fight on the surface, one can argue that Yamaguchi too was simply fighting according to his societal norms. But this is still unsatisfying. Later in the war, when Japan's defeat was both assured and readily apparent to all parties concerned, acts of folly and despair on the part of the Japanese would be more understandable. But this was June 4th, 1942, and less than an hour ago Japan was doing well in both the battle and the war. Even now, with the situation in tatters, there were still things worth fighting for besides mere honour. Yamaguchi's attitudes and behaviours ought to have reflected these current realities. Both Nagumo and Yamaguchi needed to take a broader view on their role in the war, and that of Kid Butai. If Japan was to fight effectively, aggressiveness had to be tempered with savvy. Great risks would have to be taken, but the preservation of precious war-fighting capital ships, people, initiative, and time needed to be at least as important as simple belligerence. In Yamaguchi's hands were entrusted irreplaceable assets. His position carried with it a moral responsibility to the Japanese nation to fight in such a way as to make the best use of those assets. To this day, Yamaguchi, much more than Nagumo, receives the admiration of the Japanese people because he fought with his heart. But against this must be set the ultimate condemnation of military performance. He didn't use his head, nor did Nagumo. This is not to say that either admiral was unintelligent. That clearly wasn't the problem. Yet it is equally clear that their approach to warfare was monodimensional and limited to a sphere of combat that was primarily tactical, personal, and visual. Neither man was capable of placing his tactical decisions within the larger context of the nation's war-waging. Yet even now, with the odds against them, they still had the very real possibility of extracting some measure of revenge while simultaneously preserving Hiryu for future battles. And no matter whose societal math you used, Oriental or Occidental, bringing at least one of Kid Butai's carriers home was a damned sight better than losing all four. Given all this, as soon as Kobayashi's attack was in the air, Hiryu ought to have poured on the coal and headed northwest at her best speed. Instead, both Nagumo and Yamaguchi failed to recast their current plans in the face of the enemy's new advantage. In so doing, they jointly signed the warrant for the complete annihilation of Kid Butai's carriers. If the remnants of Kid Butai were now sailing straight for disaster, the Americans, for their part, were not in the best shape to take advantage of Japanese misfortunes. The US Navy had landed a crushing blow on its enemy, but the cost had been high. The saga of Hornet's Air Group is particularly pitiable in this respect, because almost all of its woes were self-inflicted. The exact tale of what happened to Hornet's strike remains shrouded in mystery to this day, but the outlines of the situation were apparently as follows. Once John Waldron and VT-8 had left the formation at AO 825, Commander Stanhope Ring continued leading his group west. However, as the minutes ticked by, no sign of the Japanese fleet had been forthcoming, because Kid Butai was well south of the Americans. By around 0900, the situation was getting serious. Many of the aircraft were beginning to run low on fuel. The Wildcats, having been up the longest, were the first to reach the point of literally no return, and at 0915, without communicating to Ring, they turned for home. However, the fighter pilots had no clear idea of where home was. Worse yet, while they had radio homing devices, known as Z Baker, to detect signals from Hornet, they were notoriously cranky to use. The fighters were deliberately shedding altitude at a gradual rate, trading height for a bit of enhanced speed without having to burn any more gas. The downside of this trade-off was that the lower they got, the harder it would be to stay above the visual horizon line to Hornet, wherever she was. The Z Bakers required a clear line to the mothership in order to work. Worse was the fact that even though some of the pilots did receive the signal, many of them didn't understand how to use their equipment well enough to home on it. The result was that none of VF-8's pilots were able to get a good lock on their ship. They continued blindly southeastward, searching the horizon in increasing desperation. At around 1000, one pilot sighted ship wakes far to the north, but they were deemed to be those of Kido Butai. None of the men wanted to risk ditching next to the Japanese fleet and being captured. As it developed, the wakes were those of TF-16, and instead of heading for home, VF-8's aviators were now proceeding into the trackless wastes of the Pacific. After missing TF-16, the outcome was inevitable. One by one, starting at around 10:15, they began running out of fuel and ditching individually or in small groups. By 10:50, the last of them had gone in the drink. Most of the men were destined to be picked up later by PBYs, but one was killed while ditching, and another crawled into his rubber life raft and disappeared, never to be seen again. Meanwhile, Ring and Hornet's SBDs had held course westward. Just 5 minutes after the fighters peeled off, at 09:20, the SBDs received Waldron's announcement that he was under attack by enemy fighters. VB-8's commander, Lieutenant Robert R. Johnson, realized now that Waldron had been right all along. Pulling out his plotting board, he drew a 135-degree radial out from Midway and calculated where the Japanese fleet should be along that line. Accordingly, he shortly thereafter turned his 17 SBDs left to a southeast, heading to find the enemy carriers. However, he knew nothing of Nagumo's eastward movements during its recovery operations. As a result, Johnson was too far west in his reckonings. During his 50-mile jog southeast, he spotted nothing. Things were now getting critical in the fuel department, and Johnson accordingly began taking his flight back to a northeast, heading to close on where he hoped Hornet would be. It was at this juncture that VB-8 encountered an American PBY, which blinkered them a course heading to Midway. Meanwhile, though, Johnson's highly respected executive officer, Lieutenant Alfred B. Tucker III, had just started picking up the Z. Baker signal from Hornet. It was now crunch time. Tucker decided to follow the Z. Baker signal, and his 2 wingmen followed him. Johnson, either not trusting the equipment or unsure that he could make the ship, opted for Midway with his 14 remaining aircraft. Turning back to the southeast, they left Tucker to make his way back to the ship. Along the way, one of Johnson's planes suffered a catastrophic engine failure, leaving him to ditch 150 miles out. 2 more ran out of gas just short of the island. The remaining 11 planes were greeted with anti-aircraft fire from the island's marine defenders, which damaged 3 aircraft. However, they managed to make their identities known and landed on Eastern Island at around 11:35. Johnson's departure at 09:20 had left Stanhope Ring alone with Hornet's scouting squadron. Ring immediately sent his wingman over to VS-8 to inform its commander, Lieutenant Walter F. Rhodey, that he was to continue following Ring. Rhodey did as he was told until about 09:40, but by then his fuel situation had reached the point where he had to break off for home. Rhodey turned back to the east, and Ring's wingman went with him, leaving the air group commander on his own. He proceeded a bit farther and then turned around for the ship at high speed, overhauling VS-8 and arriving at Hornet at around 11:18. Rhodey and VS-8 set down shortly thereafter, followed by Tucker's detachment of 3 VS-8 aircraft at 11:45. The net result was that Hornet's air group had been gutted for absolutely no gain. Though no one on the American carriers realized it yet, VT-8 had been completely destroyed. Over a third of Hornet's fighters were gone as well. A further third of the dive bombers had ended up at Midway, where they were at least safe, but where they could not be used for carrier operations until they made it back to their ship. The remainder were on Hornet, but for the initiative of Waldron, none of Ring's group would have so much as sighted an enemy ship, let alone attacked one. And while Waldron had at least succeeded in bringing his force to battle, the truth was that he and his men had been slaughtered to little purpose. Ring's mission had been an outright disaster. He had compiled a 50% attrition rate and delivered 0 in the way of combat results. Enterprise fared better, though her losses were serious as well. VT-6 had been decimated. Only 5 of its aircraft survived their encounter with the Japanese cap, and one of these didn't make it home. Another was so shot up that after landing it was judged to be useless. This left just 3 serviceable torpedo planes on board Enterprise. The dive bombers fared poorly as well. Many had been damaged during their attack on Kid Butai, and several ditched almost immediately afterward as a result. Having detoured far to the southwest before successfully locating the Japanese fleet, they had all been low on fuel even before the attack. After attacking, many of the SBD pilots correctly judged that they couldn't make the climb back up to altitude. This meant that their Z-Bakers had more difficulty in picking up their signals, although in many cases the problem was simply one of not having sufficient gas to make it back, even if a homing signal had been detected. Damaged aircraft, wounded crewmen, and a rapidly worsening fuel situation compounded their navigational challenges still further. Not only that, but after the departure of the strike groups, Enterprise had been forced to unexpectedly maneuver to the southeast to put up additional cap fighters. As a result, she couldn't possibly reach the location where the strike flyers thought she ought to be before they had to ditch. The result was something of a repeat of Hornet's tragic VF-8 fiasco. Many of Enterprise's dive bombers returned to what they thought would be point option, only to find the open ocean. One by one, they went into the drink. Many were subsequently picked up by American PBYs or naval vessels, some after having drifted for days. Inevitably, however, a grim percentage of these men, including the crews of a group of 4 aircraft under Lieutenant Charles R. Ware of VS-6, were simply swallowed up by the impersonal vastness of the Pacific and never seen again. When all was said and done, between combat losses, ditchings, and aircraft damaged beyond repair, Enterprise lost 21 dive bombers, although the final tally did not become clear until the early afternoon. Yorktown had perhaps been rewarded for her superior deck operations, or simply had been a little luckier. VT-3 had suffered cruelly and finished the morning down a dozen aircraft, including those that were too badly damaged to make it back home after their attack. But Max Leslie's Bombing 3 returned to Yorktown without incident, though Leslie and another pilot would be forced to ditch because of fuel exhaustion before being recovered. Thus, the total tally of American aircraft lost on the morning strike was 70-12 fighters, 21 dive bombers, and 37 torpedo aircraft. This represented about a 40% casualty rate in terms of the aircraft launched. The final tally of aviators lost was, thankfully, lower than this, as many were eventually rescued. But until the remaining aircraft were recovered and reorganized, the only readily available reserve force that could be considered a cohesive unit were the 17 operational SBDs of Yorktown's VS-5. In total, the 3 American carriers between them scarcely mounted a single full air group, excluding fighters whose casualties had been somewhat lighter at this point. 10 of VS-5's aircraft were currently spotted on Yorktown's flight deck, along with a dozen cap fighters. The SBDs were awaiting word to take off on a new scouting mission. Frank Jack Fletcher's knowledge of the Japanese fleet was still thin at this point. His latest information had been forwarded to him by Raymond Spruance at 11:15, the 1000 sighting report from Gray's fighters. Fletcher had also received a communication from one of Max Leslie's pilots at 11:15 as VB-3 began landing, indicating that VB-3 had sunk an enemy carrier. This was splendid news, as far as it went. But Fletcher had been warned that the Japanese could be operating in 2 groups. If Gray had sighted only 2 enemy flat-tops and Leslie's group had sunk 1, that could mean that another pair lurked somewhere nearby. Accordingly, Fletcher judged that prudence dictated launching another reconnaissance mission to search the sea to his northwest, out to a distance of 200 miles. He began launching these aircraft at 11:33, and by 11:50 both the SBDs and the new Cap Wildcats were aloft. Even had Yamaguchi known of the terrible losses that the Americans had suffered, it should not have given him much comfort. For as bad as American casualties were, they retained 2 important advantages. First, once they reorganized their air groups, they would still have more than 60 dive bombers. In terms of raw ship-killing firepower, this represented more than quadruple what the Japanese could muster. Second, the Americans had 3 flight decks from which to operate. While this had created problems in coordination, and would do so again this afternoon, it also provided the Americans with a precious measure of redundancy. Having spare decks meant that they could suffer one of their ships rendered inoperable and still be able to find homes for any aircraft still aloft. On the Japanese side, of course, losing Hiryu meant losing the battle, period. These crucial advantages would become telling later in the afternoon. Meanwhile, another battle was taking place on board the carriers Nagumo had left behind. This, too, was going badly for the Japanese. After Nagumo's launch had left Akagi, Captain Aoki had returned to the task at hand. Having been driven from the bridge, he and his officers congregated on the forward end of the flight deck for some time. At 11:30, he ordered the ship's air personnel, along with Akagi's wounded, to be transferred to Nawaki and Arashi. Then, at 11:35, Akagi suffered a very large explosion in her hangar. This caused flames to worsen on the flight deck, which drove Aoki below to the anchor deck from which Nagumo had so recently departed. It was here that he would exercise command for the remainder of the day and much of the coming night. In many of the accounts of the battle, the situations on board the carriers at this time are described as being remarkably similar. Yet in fact, Akagi was to wage a very different struggle than Kaga or Soryu. By 11:40, Soryu had been written off for the better part of an hour, with most of her crew already having gone into the water. Kaga's fires were utterly out of control, although many men were still on board her. In contrast, the struggle to contain the blaze on Akagi developed into a grudging battle of attrition that lasted more than 9 hours. Her anchor deck was the heart of the resistance to the fires. The senior officers were all here, including her damage control chief, Commander Dobashi. Perhaps to summon up the proper samurai spirit, Dobashi had girded himself for the tasks ahead by strapping on his officer's sword. The medical staff, too, set up shop as best they could. However, with the bulk of their supplies left behind in the bowels of the ship, there was little they could do to treat the walking wounded who were now making their way forward. The curving forward bulkhead of the hangar decks loomed over the bow like a cliff, ascending until it met the underside of the flight deck, some 35 feet overhead. Up this bulkhead mounted a stairway. 2 flights of 15 steps apiece led to hatches that gave access to the lower and upper hangars. Up these steel steps now trudged groups of men, members of the damage control parties. One by one, they disappeared through the blackened doors into the canyons of fire beyond. Many of them would never return. Dobashi and Chief Engineer Tampo had several daunting tasks confronting them. One was to fight the fires. The second was to ensure that the aft magazines had been successfully flooded. The third was to get crews back into the engineering spaces to assess whether Akagi could be made operational again. If they could at least get her moving, she might have a chance. Of the 3 Japanese carriers damaged thus far, she alone had at least some marginal hope of being saved. Saved, that is, if her wounds could be tended promptly and if the right equipment was available. Indeed, had she been one of the newer American carriers, it's likely that she would have been saved, even if rendered hors de combat for months afterward. Unfortunately, Japanese damage control practice was not equal to the task set before it this morning. While a detailed comparative study of Japanese and American damage control practices is beyond the scope of this work, some pertinent points can quickly be made. First, the total number of damage control personnel on board a Japanese vessel was drastically lower than on a comparable US warship. Whereas in 1942, a US carrier could effectively number almost every one of its non-aviation staff as being able to contribute to damage control efforts in some capacity, a Japanese carrier might only have between 350 and 400 men trained out of a crew of 1,502,000. Second, the Japanese Navy took far fewer precautions to preserve the damage control capacity of its ships, both physical and human, than was prudent. The Japanese recognized the worth of distributing damage control capability within a warship to prevent a single hit from destroying a significant percentage of that capability. However, they did not apparently copy the Americans' obsession with creating redundant backup systems. For example, they did not design their fire mains such that they could be divided into independent segments. Nor did they bother dispersing and protecting the damage control parties throughout the ship. Official 1944 USN doctrine went so far as to direct damage control personnel to lie flat on the deck during a surface action, so as to avoid taking unnecessary fragmentation casualties from gun hits. One can scarcely see the Japanese, with such a fatalistic approach to the expenditure of their own human capital, even conceiving of such measures. Third, the Japanese had nowhere near the specialized equipment the US Navy used for fighting fires. Their emergency breathing gear was crude, and they had nothing like the ubiquitous handy-billy portable gasoline-powered pumps or portable generators of the US Navy. While portable pumps could not replace the ship's main pumps, they could buy time for damage control teams to repair those primary systems and get them back into action. The Japanese did not introduce a similar device until 1944, and even then produced only a limited number per ship. Such emergency capacity as was available on their ships came from large fixed emergency generators, or from manual pumps. The final factor was Japanese damage control practice appeared not to have nearly the same degree of systemization as that of the Americans. This is graphically demonstrated by the topic of flooding control. The Japanese were very concerned with flooding and installed elaborate pumping and counter-flooding mechanisms on their larger warships. Japanese damage control centers contained pegboards showing pipelines, valves, and pumps, as well as the major tanks and voids, in order to control flooding. Yet even in this, the Imperial Navy's proficiency paled in comparison to its American rival. For instance, the Japanese apparently had no standardized closure conditions such as the USN's X-ray, yoke, and zebra, which described a hierarchy of how pipe valves, hatch covers, and other openings within the ship should be secured depending on the steaming condition and battle readiness of the vessel. The Americans prepared extensive catalogues, bills, of all valves, hatches, ventilators, drains, and other equipment that might factor into the equation. They also mapped the quickest routes to potential damage points while taking into account those hatches that would be closed under battle conditions. In sum, the impression one gets is that the Japanese did not approach the problem in the sense of a warship being a collection of interrelated systems, each of which could affect the others. As an American commentator scathingly remarked about Japanese techniques, damage control, as it is understood in the US Navy, did not exist. Kid Butai's shortcomings in firefighting technique were already apparent to the men struggling to contain the spreading blaze. By 1100, the fire on Akagi had become an inferno making its way forward and consuming every scrap of inflammable material on the hangar decks in the process. Unfortunately for Commander Dobashi and his men, large gasoline-powered fires like these were essentially beyond the ability of World War II firefighting practices to extinguish. Even the US Navy had concluded grimly that once an Avgas fire develops into one of major proportions, involving 10 or more planes, it will continue to burn until all fuel is consumed, despite application of water, where water alone is employed. The best one could really hope for was to ride the fires out, contain them, cut them off from their fuel, and hope they didn't destroy the ship before they burned out. With an aviation gasoline fire, applying water has only a limited effect, because the gasoline simply floats on top of the water and continues to burn. Streams of water can, in some cases, prevent the fire from spreading, but they won't extinguish it. And if the crews are not careful, the water can actually slosh around and spread the burning gasoline over a wider area. Firefighting foam is much more effective, in that it smothers the blaze by separating it from its oxygen. But the temptation after foam has been applied is to hose it and the fuel away as soon as possible with water. This often has unforeseen and evil consequences. If the ambient temperature of the air or metal decks is still above the ignition point of the fuel, the application of water and subsequent dissolution of the foam simply re-exposes the fuel to oxygen and can actually cause the fire to reignite. In Akagi's case, this problem was probably moot. Her foam system had been rendered ineffective from the outset. All the men had was water, and precious little of that. It is known that Akagi's crew managed to rig a large hand pump on the anchor deck. This made her efforts somewhat more effective than Kaga's. But without automated pumping capacity, Commander Dobashi was bound to continue losing ground. While Akagi's situation took several hours to deteriorate beyond hope, Kaga's situation was already grim. Trapped on the starboard boat deck, her Hikocho, Commander Amagai, was doing what he could. His selection of command location was more expedient than well thought out. Smoke was pouring out of the ship and sweeping down from the flight deck above, making exercising control next to impossible. Warrant Officer Morinaga found the Hikocho here after having had a little adventure of his own in making it to the boat deck. Immediately following the large explosion in the hangar, he had found himself on the AA gallery level, just above Amagai's position. Above him, the flight deck was completely engulfed in flames. Worse yet, the ladder leading down was red-hot, leaving him trapped. Just below him, though, he could see the ship's cutter, still hanging from its davits. Seizing his opportunity, he jumped down on top of the boat, landing on the canvas cover. From there he was able to lower himself gingerly to the deck below. Knocked unconscious by the earlier blasts, Aviator Akamatsu Yuji finally awoke in the deserted ready room, head bleeding, and made his way up to the flight deck. The steel plates rimming the wooden flight deck were already so hot that the rubber soles of his shoes melted. From where he was, he could see no way down except over the edge and straight into the ocean, a frighteningly long drop. Yet the fires were coming up behind, and eventually Akamatsu had no choice. He plunged into the ocean, but his life jacket pulled him back up to the surface. All around him men were swimming, clutching whatever debris they could find. Eventually, he joined a group of other pilots supporting their injured squadron leader, Lieutenant Kitajima. After an hour, Akamatsu and his group were finally picked up by the destroyer Hagekazi. Kaga was actually still moving, crawling north at 2 to 3 knots. We know this to be true because she was being followed by an American submarine. The long-suffering Nautilus had caught up to what was left of Kid Butai. After the dive-bomber attack, her skipper, Lieutenant Sea Doctor William Brockman, had seen smoke columns on the horizon and selected the nearest one. Akagi avoided Brockman's attentions by virtue of remaining under power for some time before her rudder failed. Thus, Kaga found herself in a familiar position, tail-end Charlie, but this time in a formation of cripples, and with Brockman trying to close in. Trouble was, even after an hour's submerged movement, Brockman wasn't gaining. The conclusion was obvious. The big Japanese flat top was still limping along, even though she was wreathed in flames. On the face of it, this seems somewhat incredible, particularly given how quickly Soryu had been rendered immobile. However, there were a number of factors that explain her ability to remain underway. First, Kaga had a larger number of decks between her hangars and the engine spaces, meaning that her engine room crews were protected for longer before the heat became intolerable. The fact that she had an armoured deck above her vitals helped as well. Finally, she had not taken a freak hit that detonated deep in the ship, as Soryu apparently had. The net result was that at least one of Kaga's engine rooms must have remained operative for some time. In the end, of course, it was a feat that would cost the lives of dozens of her engineers, who stayed at their posts and performed their duties until the end. On Soryu, the situation had been judged hopeless almost from the get-go. Captain Yanagimoto's abandoned ship at 10:45 had found Pilot Mori and the survivors from the ready room already clustered on the boat deck, one deck below the bridge. The narrow walkway was packed so tight with men that they had to raise their arms above their heads. Yet more kept pushing in to escape the fires on the hangar decks, which were steadily drawing nearer. The sailors finally resorted to standing on each other's shoulders in spots. The cutter on the boat deck seemed an obvious gambit, so somebody made to lower it, but it stuck in the davits with one end still hanging from above. Realizing that the cutter was now useless, the men simply started jumping. Mori was scared. The distance looked too far. It was, in fact, some 35 feet, a comfortable enough sounding leap sitting in the safety of one's armchair, decidedly less so when clinging to a steel railing poised above the brink. But as he watched, Mori began to discern a rhythm to the waves, the long swells periodically bringing themselves closer to him. Timing his jump carefully, he jumped clear of the deck and grabbed for one of the lifeboat's ropes. Unfortunately for him, the line was no longer attached to anything, and he and the useless lanyard plummeted into the sea. Bobbing to the surface, he swam clear of Soryu's hull. At that very moment, the cutter above him decided to come hurtling down, fortunately landing nearby, rather than on top of him. Because of its bizarre entry angle, it hit the sea upside down. But Mori and some of the other swimmers righted it and began bailing it out with their footwear. They then began the laborious task of paddling away from the ship. On board Akagi, despite the steadily worsening conditions, men were still fighting the blaze in an organized fashion. But once the fires crept below the hangars, the situation became much more complex. The sheer number of spaces in the ship's innards meant that the fire had that many more places to fester in, dissipating the efforts of the crew still further. Despite the ever-present danger of unexploded munitions, it was probably easier to bring hoses into play in the relatively large space of the hangar decks. Even there, in fact, there probably wasn't enough room for more than a score of men to work at any given time. But as the fire burned deeper, men would have been forced to battle it in the twisting, darkened corridors. Deck heights on most Japanese warships were very cramped by Western standards, no more than 6 or 7 feet. In some cases, the clearance under the ductwork and other overhead hamper was as little as 5. Firefighting would have to be done in smaller groups, cut off from each other, with little coordination between them. The working conditions were nothing short of horrific. The crew hauled firefighting equipment into the ship's bowels, eyes watering and throats retching on the fumes suppurating from the smouldering bulkheads. Their mouths would in many cases have been covered by a wet rag, sometimes soaked with their own urine, to filter the worst of the fumes. Despite that, crawling along the decks would have been obligatory just to be able to breathe. Likewise, they would have dragged their comrades, shredded by bomb blasts, hideously burned or choked by smoke, back out again to the anchor deck. As men in the bowels were overcome, the survivors on the anchor deck, in many cases already wounded themselves, would have had to rouse themselves and take their places on the fire line. The plight of the engineering crews on all 3 ships, trapped in the engine spaces below the waterline, was bleaker still. Engine rooms are hot, unpleasant places to begin with, and the encroaching fires quickly rendered all of them nearly uninhabitable. It is hardly surprising that, according to the common wisdom, the engine room crews of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu died to a man, with only a few escaping from Hiryu. However, on closer examination, it appears that such universal pronouncements are untrue. Kaga and Soryu's engineers, it is true, died in droves. 2/3 of Kaga's were killed, and only a handful would ultimately survive from Soryu's. Soryu's black gang was simply trapped. Given the fewer number of decks between the engine spaces and the hangars, the fire was on top of them almost immediately, blocking their escape paths. Kaga's casualties appear to have been caused by her continued efforts to try and limp out of the area, which necessarily kept the engineers at their posts even as conditions deteriorated. Akagi's engineers, however, fared somewhat better. Akagi's official casualty list, 267 men, is surprisingly low when compared to Kaga's and Soryu's, especially given the length of her ordeal. Notwithstanding the loss of mechanics and armourers that must have occurred from the initial bomb and the subsequent casualties among the firefighting crews, such a low loss rate hardly seems believable. Her relative good fortune was the result of 2 factors. First, she suffered only a single hit. This meant that fewer men were killed outright by the initial attack, unlike Kaga and Soryu. This also ensured that Akagi's fires were more localized and slower to develop into a general blaze, giving her crew more time to get out of the way. The second factor, of course, was that Captain Aoki had ordered the engineering spaces abandoned as soon as Akagi's steering had failed at 10:43. Better still, the internal communications on board ship were still in good enough shape, at least initially, that his orders were acted on promptly. This meant that while a portion of her 303-strong engineering staff eventually did perish, either below decks or in damage control efforts, nearly two-thirds ultimately survived. This represented a far better survival rate among Akagi's engineers than any of the other carriers would boast this day. Back on Kaga, Amagai and Morinaga were now crowded with many aviators and other survivors into a steadily shrinking space that clung like an eyrie to the side of the ship. Behind and above them the fires advanced steadily. Far below was the sea. Finally, on his own initiative, Amagai told the men to jump for it. Morinaga peeled off his flight suit and boots. Around them, some of the newer recruits were protesting that they didn't know how to swim. Amagai was adamant. They were dead for sure if they stayed where they were. Morinaga didn't wait, but jumped as far out as he could. It was a long way down. Others followed suit. One man was going to perish regardless. Lieutenant Ogawa Shoichi, Kaga's Kanbaku Buntaicho, and a famous veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor, as well as the fighting in China. Ogawa had been badly wounded in the initial attack on Kaga. The long fall to the water would have killed him outright, and his wounds, he knew, were mortal in any case. Smiling complacently, he urged Amagai to abandon ship with the other pilots. Finally, Amagai bade him farewell and jumped into the sea with the last of the aviators. From below in the water, the men could see Ogawa still. He had crawled to the ship's railing and was waving and yelling encouragement to them. Then he lost his final strength and died in front of their eyes. Hanging on to his line, dangling below Soryu's bridge, Gunnery Officer Kanao was unaware of the fact that the ship had been largely abandoned above him. All he knew was that he couldn't swim worth a damn, and that the lanyard was literally his lifeline. Grimly, he hung on for what seemed like hours. After a while, one of the sailors swimming nearby noticed his plight and swam up to him. It turned out to be one of Kanao's subordinates, a midshipman. He tied the line around Kanao's waist. At first, Kanao was grateful, but being secured to a line was something of a two-edged sword. It assured Kanao's security, but also tied his motions to those of the ship. Though the water was calm and shiny, perhaps because of the oil being spread on it, Soryu still rolled appreciably. When she did so, the line hauled Kanao bodily out of the water and slammed him against her flank. He quickly became adept at using his legs to cushion the blows, though it hurt. Still, it was better than drowning. After a time, Kanao heard someone shouting his name. It was Lieutenant Commander Asanumi, Soryu's navigator, who he had last seen on the bridge. "Hi, gunnery officer!" Asanumi shouted. "Abandon ship has been ordered. You must swim away from the ship." "I cannot swim," Kanao called back. "Please go ahead." "I'll swim then," Asanumi said. "Try to fight back, don't give up." The navigator swam on. Kanao wondered if perhaps the navigation officer was the last person he would see in this lifetime. Despite the rope, he felt marooned in the middle of the ocean. He had no control over his fate. He could neither swim away nor climb back on board the ship. The only thing he could do was to cling to the line and try to survive the relentless buffeting against Soryu's hull. Kanao suddenly saw someone on the bridge, looking out the window. It was Captain Yanagimoto. His face was scarlet red, and it reminded Kanao of the fairy tale monsters of his childhood. It had a totally calm and relaxed expression, like a Buddha, Kanao remembered later. "Skipper!" he tried to yell, but no sound came out. The next time he looked up, the face was gone. Other men apparently saw Yanagimoto as well, standing on the starboard side of the bridge, exhorting the men in the water. Soon afterward, though, the captain disappeared into the fires surrounding Soryu's island. So ended one of Japan's most beloved commanders. The ship was silent now. Kanao was overwhelmed with sorrow, both at his own likely fate and that of Soryu's skipper. Just then, he noticed a ladder floating closer to him from the direction of the carrier's stern. Desperate to have done with the line and his demoralizing suspension, he untied himself, let go, and splashed toward the ladder. Grabbing it, he simply held on for dear life. On board Hiryu, Yamaguchi and his staff were beginning to get edgy. If Chikuma No. 5's previous report was correct, the enemy ought to have been close by. Not only that, but the scout had gone on the air at 11:32, so that the Kanbaku Buntaich could home in on its signal. Yet it was now noon, Kobayashi had been in the air an hour, and no one had as yet received any report from him. In fact, unbeknownst to Yamaguchi or his staff, Kobayashi had already sent 2 signals back to Hiryu, but neither of them was received, or perhaps decoded, until almost an hour later. As a result, the first intimation that Yamaguchi received that his force had, in fact, found the enemy did not occur until 12:10. This signal, though, didn't come from Kobayashi, but from another anonymous aircraft in the dive bomber Hikotai. It said simply, "Am bombing enemy carrier." After that, silence. Yamaguchi was in the dark. However, he knew that at least some of his dive bombers were now attacking an enemy carrier. That was good news, as far as it went. Furthermore, the fact that Kobayashi had managed to reach the enemy within an hour and 10 minutes flight time meant that the Americans were indeed relatively close. This broadly confirmed Chikuma No. 5's spotting report. Yamaguchi took this opportunity to order the fleet's remaining scout planes put in readiness. Unfortunately, Chikuma's No. 4 plane was now the only long-range scout ready to go. Chikuma No. 1 had been recovered earlier with some sort of problem, and was down. Neither Tone's No. 1 aircraft, nor Amari's No. 4 were ready either. Kido Butai was beginning to run short of quality scouts. For the time being, Yamaguchi was simply pressing ahead, preparing Tomonaga's follow-up strike, which would be ready within another hour or so, and hoping he would receive further information from Kobayashi in the meantime. It would be right to wonder why prepping and spotting Tomonaga's 16-plane strike was taking so long, given that Yamaguchi originally wanted to launch at around 12:20. After all, Tomonaga's group had returned to the ship almost 3 hours earlier. This delay couldn't be readily attributed to KP operations. Kobayashi had taken off at 10:57. Since then, Hiryu had landed 6 zeros at 11:34, and that was it. The rest of the force's fighters were staying aloft for the time being. Hiryu's flight deck was wide open for spotting. On the face of it, it would seem that Tomonaga should have been able to follow Kobayashi's group within about an hour and a half of the latter's launch. Yet apparently this wasn't possible. There are 2 plausible explanations for what would develop into a 2.5-hour separation between Hiryu's 2 counterstrikes. Either the aircraft and hangar crews were exhausted by the day's operations, or Yamaguchi was hoping to locate and confirm a second target and then hit it as well. Either way, Hiryu's operational tempo was slowing to a crawl. Like a drowning man, Kido Butai's efforts were becoming feebler and less well coordinated. The crisp synchronization of the morning's operations were gone at the very moment that decisive action was required. Instead, Hiryu was fighting raggedly, with an air of desperation. noon found Nagumo back in control of his fleet and in effective communication with all units, including Hiryu. His flagship, Nagara, was leading the surface units of Kido Butai toward the enemy along course 60 degrees. Kondo had sent word that his second fleet was rushing to reinforce Nagumo. Though Kondo could not arrive till early morning, Nagumo likely believed that if he could just survive till sunset after engaging the enemy, his battleships and cruisers could likely take good care of themselves in the darkness until help arrived to turn the tide. It was at this juncture, after an hour and a half of silence since receiving Abe's 10:50 communiqué, that Yamamoto finally made his presence felt. He and his staff had recovered from their earlier shock and formulated a plan to recover the situation. Removed from the battlefield, they, even more than Nagumo, retained an unwarranted optimism that the situation could yet be retrieved. As Combined Fleet's staff saw it, the biggest immediate worry was Nagumo's deficit in flight decks. When Kondo joined Nagumo, he would add light carrier Zuiho to the mix, but that was slender support. At best. In a pinch, the ancient Hosho might be committed as well. Finally, there was a slim possibility that either Akagi or Kaga could be restored to action. No reports of their abandonment had yet been received by Yamamoto, and he knew that they had been ordered to withdraw northwest. However, it did not take a tactical genius to see that the most potent resource for turning the tide of battle unfortunately lay with the two carriers tied up in the Aleutians operation. The sooner Kakuta could bring Cardiff 4 south into the battle, the better. The obvious thing to do was to find a quick way to reorganize and concentrate as much of this strength as possible, while simultaneously calling on Kakuta's carrier force. The American carriers were not the only problem that would have to be dealt with if the battle was to be turned around. There was still the question of Midway's air power. The staff believed this threat could be neutralized by gunpower. Kondo could detach Kurita's cruiser squadron to dash ahead and bombard Midway before dawn. If all went well, the Japanese would only have to contend with the American carriers come the morning of the 5th, and there was reason to hope that these would be whittled down in the meantime. Accordingly, at 12:20, Yamamoto sent out a general dispatch to his forces. First, as expected, the tanker force would withdraw from the main body, whereupon Yamamoto would move south to Nagumo's aid. The Midway invasion force was to withdraw temporarily to the northwest, while Kondo was to charge northeast toward Kido Butai. Finally, the second mobile striking force was to come south. About an hour later, at 13:10, he elaborated that Kondo should dispatch a portion of his force to shell and destroy the enemy airbase on Midway. At the same time, he temporarily postponed the invasion of both Midway and Kiska. Spurred into action, Kido Butai continued preparations for a surface battle. Nagumo shortly informed his entire force he planned to destroy the enemy by daylight action, and that they should expect to encounter the enemy momentarily. This last remark is puzzling, until it is recalled that Nagumo had assumed that the US forces were presumably still closing his own, and the gap had supposedly been narrowing for the last 2 hours. If that was true, then Nagumo was within his rights to assume that contact would soon be made. Chikuma and Tone dutifully reported at 12:25 and 12:29 respectively that they had completed preparations for torpedo action. It is true that at this point in the battle, neither Yamaguchi nor Nagumo had much concrete information. Yet, despite the earlier fragmentary reports that the enemy lay within 100 miles or so, the idea that either the enemy or Nagumo's force could somehow magically bridge the physical gap between them was folly. This could only have occurred if the enemy was interested in a surface brawl himself. The thought ought to have occurred to the commander of Kido Butai that his opponents were unlike for Nagumo's reasoning is that he was reverse projecting his own preferred tactics on those of the enemy. That is to say, the overall Japanese plan at Midway was built on the concept of the Japanese carriers whittling down the Americans so that the main body could land the killing blow. Finding himself in a dramatically weakened position, he might have imagined that the Americans were going to come gunning for him with their own surface forces. Indeed, his earlier belief that the American forces were primarily surface-oriented may have been coming back to haunt him. Of course, neither Fletcher nor Spruance had the slightest interest in participating in a surface battle, either during broad daylight or at night. Nagumo may also have imagined that Kobayashi's strike would disable what he still hoped was just a single American carrier, and thus transform the battle into a pure surface affair. But any staff officer worth his salt could have told him that the 10-20 dive bomber attack had to have been the work of more than one enemy carrier. Given that, and in the complete absence of any hard information regarding the results of Kobayashi's attack, Nagumo was clearly guilty of grasping at straws. At 12:40, however, came an update from Chikuma's No. 5 search plane that finally put paid to these illusions. Sight what appears to be two large enemy cruisers in position bearing 15 degrees, distance 130 miles from my point of origin. In addition, I see what appears to be one carrier and one destroyer. Course north, speed 20 knots. Nagumo's face surely fell upon receiving this news, and his subsequent actions revealed his realization of the full import of the message. The enemy force appeared to be sheering away north and opening the range. This killed any immediate hopes of bringing about a surface action. As Nagumo himself put it later, with a trace of unintentional irony. From this it became evident that the enemy was trying to put distance between himself and us. Nagumo thereafter chose to parallel the enemy's course and try to remain to the northwest of him. He would await the developments from Hiryu's airstrikes, the arrival of reinforcements, and new search reports before taking further action. Accordingly, at 12:45, Nagumo changed course from 060 to due north, speed 20 knots. At the same moment Nagumo was turning north, an additional snippet regarding Kobayashi's attack was finally received by Hiryu. One of the dive bombers signalled, "Enemy carrier is burning. I see no friendly planes in range of visibility. I am homing." The interesting part of this message was not so much what it said, but who it came from. Neither Lieutenant Kobayashi nor his second-in-command, Lieutenant Kondo, had transmitted it. Instead, it seems most likely that the message was sent from ENS, Nakayama Shimematsu, who commanded the lead plane in the second Shotai of Kondo's second Chutai. The fact that the 12:45 transmission came from the middle of the second Chutai's batting order had to have caused some anxious looks on Hiryu's bridge. Nakayama would have let his superiors report first if they had been able to. The fact that he had transmitted meant that he considered himself the senior survivor of the squadron. There was only one conclusion that could be reached. Kobayashi's attack had been very costly. However, until the dive bombers landed, it would be impossible to gauge what impact they had made. Meanwhile, on board Akagi, a rather strange turn of events was taking place. At 12:03, the flagship's engines had suddenly come to life. Slowly, the stricken giant began moving in a great circle to starboard, her rudder still jammed. To Captain Aoki, this was all rather mysterious. Ships typically don't just turn on of their own accord. The fact that the engineering spaces had been deliberately abandoned at 10:43 should have meant that the machinery had been secured in good order as well, making it less believable that Akagi had spontaneously re-engaged her own engines. Thus, despite the Nagumo report's characterization of Akagi's movement as being automatic, it is almost impossible to contrive a set of circumstances whereby she resumed her circling without human intervention. Oddly enough, Commander Tampo had been in the engineering spaces just 15 minutes before and was convinced that no one remained alive there. But in truth, his recent inspection was unlikely to have encompassed the entirety of the engine rooms, which were vast, dark, and exceedingly hot and smoky. The riddle needed solving, though, so an engineering ensign named Akiyama was dispatched forthwith back below. Making his way down from the anchor deck, Akiyama would have passed through the officers' berthing spaces in the bow, down through the ship's machine shops, and finally down another long vertical ladder that led to the electrical control rooms just forward of boiler room number 1. He now stood on the lowest deck in the ship, some 25 feet below the waterline. Making his way aft through the pitch black, he might have peered into the boiler control room located at frame 94, and then the one located further aft at frame 108. Shining his light briefly on the dials and gauges within, Akiyama would have discovered that Akagi still had some level of steam in her boilers. Even in the midst of evacuation, there would have been no reason to have bled her steam off, particularly if it was hoped that power could be restored later. The engine room controls themselves were located in both the forward and aft engine rooms. With the fumes growing worse and worse, Akiyama would have been lucky to have made it into the forward engine room at all. This compartment was cavernous, with choking vapours adding to the Stygian blackness. Akiyama wouldn't have been able to see much more than what was directly in front of his flashlight's narrow blade of light silent machinery and hurried glimpses of his fallen shipmates. But the aft engines were another 150 feet further astern, and the only way to get there was through cramped passageways that ran under the outboard shaft alleys. Given the horrendous atmospheric conditions, and finding nothing but corpses in the spaces he ventured into, it would not have been surprising if Akiyama concluded that conditions were untenable in the aft engine rooms as well. He couldn't really linger. His mission, after all, was to bring information back to Aoki and Tampo, and he couldn't very well do that if he was dead. Akiyama returned in short order to the anchor deck. Everyone in the engine rooms had succumbed, he reported. Yet Akiyama was almost certainly wrong in his estimation. Instead, it seems likely that there were men in Akagi's aft engine room about noon, but that no one on her bow was aware of their actions. At this point, the two extremities of the ship were completely cut off from each other. Survivors were almost certainly gathered on the ship's fantail, many of which would have come up from the engine spaces via a hatch in the steering room spaces. It is quite possible that some of these men, perhaps led by some anonymous engineering lieutenant, went below again in an effort to flood the magazines and perhaps restore power to the ship. This speculation is substantiated by the Nagumo report itself. We know that Akagi's aft magazines were not flooded until about 1300. Given the likely shock damage in the stern, which had evidently damaged the piping, the only way these spaces were going to be flooded was manually. If so, then somebody had to have ventured into the aft machinery spaces to do the deed. Not coincidentally, this would have put a damage control party, almost certainly composed of engineering personnel, directly adjacent to the aft engine rooms. It would not have been surprising if they somehow managed to get the ship underway again. Whatever the explanation, Akagi was now moving, although her stately, blazing procession was ultimately doomed to lead nowhere. However, her circling wasn't necessarily all bad. One of the beneficiaries was Fujita Iyozo, Soryu's fighter ace. Having been shot down over Kido Butai during the torpedo attack on Hiryu, he had been drifting in his inflatable life vest with no way to attract anyone's attention. All the ships that he could see were on the horizon. He was still starving hungry, and all in all things did not look good. However, to his amazement, he now saw Akagi moving again, and she seemed to be coming his way. Fujita started swimming. As Akagi moved, so too moved her escorts. Before long, Fujita found that destroyer Nawaki was heading in his general direction as well. Fujita began waving frantically. For a minute, it appears that Nawaki mistook him for an enemy aviator, as she cranked one of her 25mm machine guns around toward him. However, at this point fate intervened yet again, as both Nawaki's navigator and her executive officer recognized the man in the water. All three of them had been Etajima classmates. Within minutes, strong hands helped Fujita climb to the destroyer's deck. In the distance, he could see other boats from Nawaki rescuing sailors from the burning carrier beyond, but he was too tired to really take in all the details. Then, after being given food and a dry uniform, the exhausted flyer simply fell asleep where he sat, on Nawaki's main deck. At 1300, Yamaguchi finally received more definitive word about what he was up against, conveyed by Rear Admiral Kimura in Nagara. An American pilot from Yorktown's VT-3 had been plucked from the water by Arashi and interrogated, and from him the Japanese had learned that there was not just one American carrier present, but three: Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. During his interrogation, the unfortunate prisoner ends. Wesley Osmus divulged that Yorktown was operating separately from the other two flat tops. He also related the details of the American sortie from Pearl Harbor when they had reached Midway, and the composition of the American task forces. Osmus's information wasn't perfect, but it confirmed two important points. First, the Japanese now knew that they were up against a powerful adversary. Second, since the American carriers were apparently operating separately, It was now unclear whether both American task forces had been found yet by the Japanese. This was shortly confirmed by Soryu's D4Y scout. Returning to the task force and finding Hiryu's deck already spotted with torpedo planes, Ida dropped a message tube which confirmed that the enemy was operating in 2 task forces, containing 3 carriers, with the second enemy task force located to the south of the formation Kobayashi had attacked. Here, from the mouth of the enemy and from their own scouts, was confirmation of the grim odds facing the Japanese. Even presuming that Kobayashi's force had inflicted severe damage on one of the American flat tops, Hiryu simply didn't have the strength to face another 2. In fact, even attempting to construct a strategic calculus by means of simplistic math, like one of our carriers versus 2 of theirs, was facile, as it didn't plumb the depths to which Hiryu's air power had sunk. At this juncture, both sides were hurt. Nobody was operating full air groups any longer. Combat strength was now measured by having both residual air power and redundant flight decks. However, Hiryu's air group was but a shadow of its former self, and Yamaguchi had only a single flight deck from which to attack. Had Akagi escaped her doom at the hands of Dick Best, Yamaguchi's approach to the battle might have made more sense. But now, more than ever, the intelligent course of action was for Hiryu to break off the action. Not opening the range to the enemy, even for the 45 minutes remaining before Tomonaga would be able to take off, was simply the wrong thing to do, because it needlessly compounded Hiryu's risks of detection and subsequent attack. Yet the only discernible immediate response to the reports from the Soryu's scout plane and Enzias Osmus's interrogation was Nagumo signalling to Tone and Haruna at 1310 that they should launch reconnaissance aircraft to search between 0 and 90 degrees, true to localize the second American task force. Figuring out exactly where each of Kido Butai's constituent components was at this moment is a complex undertaking, because the Japanese force was scattered. The heavy units, Crew Div 8 and Bat Div 3, were sticking close to Nagara while closing the Americans. As mentioned, though, Nagumo had subsequently changed course to 0 degrees at 12:45 and would shortly change course again to 070 degrees at 13:22. He was to stay on this heading until he was finally rejoined by Hiryu, which was overhauling him from the south at 14:40. Hiryu's whereabouts are more difficult to determine, as we have no surviving course chart for her. The evidence indicates that after moving away from the vicinity of Soryu at around 11:30, she had operated on a roughly back-and-forth course a bit east of the morning's disaster. Thus, when the likely courses of the Nagara and Hiryu groups are plotted, Hiryu ends up to the east and south of Nagumo's position, after the latter started his noon counter-thrust toward the Americans. Yet, while Hiryu was detached from Nagumo, the evidence suggests that she was still within blinker distance of him, probably using Crew Div 8 as an intermediary. Hence, Yamaguchi was not really out of touch with Nagumo from the standpoint of command and control. Again, what all this points to is a rather different picture of Japanese command arrangements during the hours immediately after the 1020 catastrophe. Instead of tagging along behind Yamaguchi, Nagumo was attempting to lead from the fore. Likewise, Yamaguchi, despite his aggressive reputation, was far from closing the enemy, or even steering northeast at anything like 30 knots. Instead, we see hints of a different picture, wherein Hiryu was essentially stalking the enemy, using Nagumo's forces as something of a shield while conducting her launches and recoveries. Then, when Nagumo eventually gave up the attempt to close with the enemy, he chose a course whereby Hiryu could rejoin him relatively quickly. One imperative the Japanese did have at this juncture was maintaining contact with the one American carrier they had found. Unfortunately, Petty Officer Takazaki and Chikuma No. 5 were having a difficult time with this. As a result, they had been on and off the air during their mission. At 12:17, Takazaki, who had lingered in the area of Kobayashi's attack, came on the air to report that he had been pursued by enemy aircraft and had lost contact with the task force. 3 minutes later, though, he signaled that they had re-established contact with the Americans. Thereafter, Takezaki's pilot, PO-3C Hara Hisashi, had played a cat-and-mouse game with the American fighters in the area, ducking into clouds when threatened. At 13:14, Takezaki transmitted that he had sighted an enemy carrier task force on course Iro 20, making 24 knots. Interestingly, he made no mention of whether the carrier he saw was burning, as Kobayashi's squadron had last reported it to be. Yorktown was still dead in the water at this point in time, so it seems likely that Takezaki was seeing TF-16 instead, although he didn't apparently realize it. Hopefully, the forthcoming scouting launch would help remedy some of these deficiencies. One benefit of the enemy's proximity was that it allowed the Japanese to more usefully employ their shorter-ranged Type 95 spotting planes. At 13:15, Abe had Tone signal his vessels to launch a total of 5 aircraft. Each plane was to search to 150 miles, then turn left for an additional 30 miles. However, 5 minutes later, Haruna blinkered back to report that she had already launched all 3 of her aircraft at 1300. Their orders were to fan out across an arc stretching from 40 degrees westward to 340 degrees. What Abe thought of his over-eager subordinate's initiative remains a mystery, but as it transpired, one of Haruna's scout planes was destined to make a later contact with the Americans. This is odd in itself, in that at this point in the battle the Americans were almost due east of Kid Butai, meaning that Haruna's northward-aimed fan of aircraft should have encountered nothing but open ocean. By the same token, whether Kirishima in fact ever sent off her own plane down the 10-degree search line, which should have overlapped one of Haruna's birds, remains a mystery. On board Hiryu, preparations for launching the next strike were finally being completed. By about 1300, 10 Type 97 Kank were on deck and beginning to warm up. Since Yamaguchi's earlier communiqué to Yamamoto, it had apparently been decided to send along not 3 but 6 more Zeros for the mission, led by Lieutenant Mori Shigeru. Mori, dividing his force into 3 two-plane Shotai, would lead a grab bag of fighters. One of these was flown by W.O. Minagishi Yoshijiro, who had actually been one of Kobayashi's fighter escorts earlier in the afternoon. He had come limping back to the ship not long after Kobayashi's departure, his plane shot up in a fracas with some American dive bombers. Whatever damage he had suffered must have been fairly minor, as he was going back up just an hour and a half later. He would lead the second Shotai. The third Shotai would be headed up by Kaga's highly experienced PO-1C Yamamoto Akira, flying with another survivor from Kaga's fighter unit, PO-3C Bando Makoto. Lieutenant Tomonaga would once again lead the Type 97 Hikotai, such as it was. He opted to split his tiny command into 2 5-plane Chutai, placing himself at the head of the first. The second would be headed up by Lieutenant Hashimoto Toshio, who was normally Tomonaga's observer navigator. However, Tomonaga thought it best to split the 2 most senior officers in the Hikotai between the 2 Chutai. As such, Hashimoto would be flying in PO-1C Takahashi Toshio's plane. Just then, it was discovered that the repairs made to Tomonaga's left-wing fuel tank, which had been holed during the morning strike, had been ineffective. The tank still leaked. When lugging a heavy torpedo, a Type 97's 225-litre outboard tanks couldn't be filled in any case, meaning that only Tomonaga's starboard 350-litre inboard tank could be fueled. He probably wouldn't have enough gas to make it home from the mission. Several of the pilots requested that they take the damaged bird instead, but Tomonaga cheerfully declined, joking that the Yankees were only 90 miles away and that he could make it there and back again on just a single tank. The pilot briefing was delivered personally by Admiral Yamaguchi. He encouraged his men to do their utmost. They were truly the last hope for the force. Knowing that there were 3 American carriers out there, and that one had been hit already, it was absolutely imperative that they attack one of the undamaged American vessels. The men nodded grimly and started making their way to their waiting aircraft. Yamaguchi was clearly moved by the sacrifice of Hiryu's Hikotaichi. As Tomonaga turned to mount his aircraft, Yamaguchi moved to shake his hand. Solemnly he told the lieutenant, "I will gladly follow you." To the men standing nearby, it seemed clear that the Admiral had no intention of returning alive from this battle if men like Tomonaga were already making the ultimate sacrifice for their country. At around 13:15, while Tomonaga's unit was still being briefed, the first of Kobayashi's dive bombers began returning. Finding the flight deck already spotted, one of them buzzed the ship and dropped a message, which Dr. Kawaguchi Susumu, Hiryu's Hikochu, retrieved. According to the note, the attack force had left the enemy force at a bearing of 80 degrees and 90 miles distant. It was composed of 5 heavy cruisers and a carrier, the latter burning heavily. Kawaguchi entrusted this information to Lieutenant Hashimoto, not knowing that Tomonaga's backseater would not be with him on this flight. Thus, Tomonaga was not in possession of the most current information on Yorktown's location as he started his mission. At last, all was in readiness. Hiryu began launching at 13:30, watched intently by every man fortunate enough to be topside. None was more attentive than Admiral Yamaguchi, who stood gazing solemnly as the aircraft went up one by one. Hiryu's final strike force assembled, wheeled, and made their way toward the eastern horizon. Win or lose, it was all down to this. Near at hand, Captain Kaku was already giving orders to begin landing Kobayashi's aircraft. After recovering them, Hiryu would swing out of the wind and take up a northerly course, intending to converge with Nagara and Nagumo. When Tomonaga was on his way, Commander Kawaguchi cleared the deck and recovered aircraft. First to come down was Soryu's Type 2 recon bird, followed by the remnants of the dive bomber strike force. Of the 24 aircraft Hiryu had sent aloft with Kobayashi at 10:57, just 6 were landing now, 5 Kanbaku and a Zero. The fighter and one of the Kanbaku were both shot up to such a degree as to be unserviceable. Lieutenants Kobayashi and Kondo were not among the returning aircraft. The details of the mission were difficult to discern from the survivors. Their accounts didn't jibe terribly well. As such, Hiryu's officers found it difficult to piece together a cohesive account from the men until long after the battle was actually over. Kobayashi's mission seemed to have started out well enough. After launching, the strike force had proceeded at relatively low altitude because the visibility seemed better, though they climbed as they got closer to the suspected location of the American fleet. Then, at 11:32, had come the welcome signal from Chikuma No. 5 that would guide the attack birds to the target, followed by Hiryu's own message 10 minutes later, rebroadcasting the location of the Americans. However, at about the same time, Kobayashi's bombers had lost their fighter cover. Lieutenant Shigematsu's Zeros spotted what appeared to be enemy torpedo aircraft below and ahead of them. He asked for and received permission to engage them. In retrospect, this was clearly a mistake. Indulging in a taste for combat against enemy aircraft that were of no immediate threat to Hiryu was a poor reason to forego close support of Kobayashi's precious bombers. Yet this was typical for Japanese fighters, who had not yet begun to internalize the fundamental truth that close support was the only kind of support that really mattered. Diving down with his 6 Zeros, Shigematsu had encountered not enemy TBDs, but Lieutenant Charles Ware's doomed flight of Enterprise SBDs. The ensuing affray had been sharp. The Japanese made numerous passes at the Dauntlesses, but discovered for themselves what many of their Cap compatriots had already learned earlier in the morning. American dive bombers were formidable opponents when they flew in close formation. The Zeros were rudely surprised by the hot reception they got. In fact, they succeeded in shooting down none of the SBDs. However, 2 Kansen, WO Minagishi Yoshijiro and PO-1C Sasaki Hitoshi, were damaged severely enough in return that they had to break off the fight and limp back to Hiryu. In the end, only Minagishi's Zero managed to make it back, just in time to be turned around for Tomonaga's outbound strike mission. Sasaki was forced to ditch near one of Hiryu's escorts at about 12:30. It was thus a rather chastened Shigematsu who led his surviving quartet of Zeros back in pursuit of Kobayashi's force, which had gone on ahead. As it developed, Shigematsu's fighters were not available to Kobayashi when it counted most. At 11:52, Yorktown's radar had detected an unknown flight of aircraft coming in. Her radar operator was one of the best in the business, and he managed to coax from his rather primitive equipment the fact that these aircraft were in the process of climbing, something friendly aircraft looking to land would never have done. The American cap had just been in the process of rotating. However, Yorktown had 20 fighters up, and radar gave them time enough, barely, to send the majority to intercept Kobayashi. Even so, the Wildcats didn't have time to gain sufficient altitude, nor were they properly formed up, forcing them to attack singly or in small groups. Kobayashi's formation was arrayed in a right echelon of 2 chutai, each formed into its own V of 3 shotai. Kobayashi sighted the enemy carrier at noon and promptly sent a message to Hiryu announcing that he was attacking. Almost immediately thereafter, though, the Kanbaku unit had been set upon by American fighters coming in from below and ahead. The Americans had pressed their attacks boldly. One Wildcat, piloted by Lieutenant J.G. Elbert S. McCuskey, took one run against the formation, came around for a second pass, and found itself facing Yamashita's second shotai almost head-on. Like a hawk hitting a flock of pigeons, McCuskey blew Yamashita's formation apart. Several Japanese pilots were forced to break ranks to avoid being rammed by his Wildcat. Meanwhile, Kobayashi's lead shotai had been similarly thrown into confusion. As soon as the Japanese formation had broken, a fresh group of American fighters had charged into their heart, firing with great precision. Several Kanbaku had gone down in flames almost immediately, including the leader of the second shotai, Lieutenant Kondo. Lieutenant Arthur J. Brassfield single-handedly annihilated a shotai of bombers that made it out of the melee and attempted to break toward Yorktown. Another pair was forced to jettison their bombs. In several cases, the nimble Type 99s tried maneuvering onto the tails of the American Wildcats, although this tactic had met with little success. It was around this time that Shigematsu's Zeros finally rejoined the battle. It was a good thing, too, as new elements of Grummons were continually appearing on the scene. Thereupon, Shigematsu's quartet had a furious exchange with the American Wildcats, whose pilots were more than willing to mix it up with their opposite numbers. The results were again sharply unpleasant for the Japanese, with 3 of Shigematsu's men shot down for only a single Grumman bagged in return. The doughty Shigematsu was the only survivor. Finally, at about 12:10, the remaining 7 armed Kanbaku had begun their attack runs on Yorktown, a fact that one of their number, perhaps Lieutenant Nakayama, had thereupon signalled to Hiryu. The coherence of their original formation long since destroyed, the Japanese bombers were forced to attack singly or in small groups. Before them lay the American task force. The enemy flat top had been closely guarded by a tight ring of cruisers and destroyers, each of which could contribute to the defence of the carrier in the centre. The Japanese had come in from directions ranging across half the compass, peeling into sharp, precise dives. Just as the men of Kid Butai had been forced to give grudging admiration to the technique of Enterprise's and Yorktown's dive bombers 2 hours earlier, so too the men on Yorktown were aware that they were watching seasoned professionals in action. The Japanese pilots attacked coolly and deliberately, holding their dives to the absolute limit while displaying an utter disdain for the ferocious anti-aircraft fire being directed back at them. These men were all part of Nagumo's A-team that had been held in reserve from the morning strike against Midway. The results of their attack on Yorktown proved that their Admiral's faith in them had been well deserved. The first Type 99 had attacked from directly astern, holding his dive to the last possible second. In fact, to several observers it appeared that this particular pilot had no intention of pulling out at all. However, contemptuous as Japanese Kanbaku pilots were of anti-aircraft fire, the immutable truth was that American flak was intense and accurate. The 1.1-inch machine guns located aft of Yorktown's island summarily chopped this particular bomber into pieces just as it released its weapon, a 242-kilogram high-explosive bomb intended for flak suppression. The smashed kanbaku fell in 3 sections into the carrier's wake. Nevertheless, this pilot had aimed his weapon with great skill. Tumbling end over end, the bomb hit Yorktown just abaft her midships elevator, detonating in a bright flash. It was almost as if the unknown pilot was exacting a posthumous retribution, as his bomb slaughtered the 1.1-inch crews who had just shot him down. Despite the ship's temporarily lessened firepower, Hiryu's second dive bomber was given exactly the same treatment. Diving along a similar line from astern, his kanbaku was blown into pieces by flak and fell headlong into the ship's wake. The detonation of his high-explosive bomb peppered Yorktown's stern with fragments and started some incidental fires on the fantail. The third attacker, the last man from the first shotai, was PO-2C Tsuchiya Takayoshi. Approaching from astern as well, Tsuchiya held a steep 75-degree dive down to low level and secured what appeared to be a hit with his semi-armor-piercing bomb. In fact, though, he planted it close alongside the carrier's stern. Tsuchiya avoided the fate of his 2 comrades and managed to scoot away at wave-top height. Next came 4 aircraft from the second shotai. They attacked in an arc across Yorktown's starboard beam. Yorktown, though, was a difficult target to hit, manoeuvring as she was at 30 knots. Almost as soon as the second shotai started coming in, she began executing a turn to port to throw off their aim. The next attacker was PO-1C Matsumoto Sadao, who began angling in almost immediately after Tsuchiya's run. Coming in slightly less steeply than Tsuchiya, he thought he secured a hit on the elusive carrier's stern. Yet he too had actually dropped his high-explosive bomb in Yorktown's wake. However, Yorktown's luck had finally run out as the next kanbaku headed in. This bird was piloted by W.O. Nakazawa Iwao, in whose back seat rode Special Service Ns. Nakayama Shimamatsu, leader of the second shotai. Nakazawa dove steeply from about 8,000 feet. His aim was true, and despite the heavy fire being thrown up by Yorktown and her escorts, he planted his 250-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bomb directly amidships. Immediately, Yorktown began belching enormous clouds of thick black smoke,